The nights grew cooler in Dusty Creek, and the scent of autumn drifted through the air. It had been a week since Luke rode away, and though Martha told herself she was used to solitude, the house felt emptier than before. She'd sit by the fire at night, sewing by lamplight, pretending the wind at the door wasn't whispering his name. But one evening, as she stepped outside to bring in the last of the laundry, she saw it, a thick, dark plume of smoke rising over the distant hills. At first, she thought it was a storm cloud. Then came the faint crackle in the air and the acrid scent of burning grass. Her heart lurched. The direction of the smoke, it was coming from the Kerrigan ranch. Without thinking, she dropped the basket, ran to the stable, and saddled her old mare. The wind was hot, whipping her hair as she rode. The closer she got, the clearer it became. The fire was real and raging, leaping through the dry grass, swallowing fences, barns, and the horizon. Men were shouting, forming lines with buckets, trying to control the blaze. But it was spreading too fast. Then she saw him, Luke, his shirt soaked in sweat, face blackened with soot, shouting orders over the roar of the flames. He was standing dangerously close to the collapsing barn, trying to free the panicked horses trapped inside. "Luke!" she screamed. He turned, startled, then cursed under his breath. "Martha, what are you doing here?" "Helping," she shouted back, jumping off the horse. "You'll get yourself killed." "I can't leave them," he yelled. Before she could argue, the barn door split open with a violent crack, flames shooting skyward. Luke disappeared into the smoke. For one heart-stopping moment, Martha froze. Then instinct took over. She grabbed a soaked blanket from the ground, wrapped it around herself, and ran after him. Inside, the heat was unbearable. The air tasted of ash. Through the haze, she saw him struggling with the last horse's halter, coughing violently. She rushed to his side. "Luke, you fool, move!" Together, they freed the terrified animal and pushed it toward the open air. As the horse bolted, a burning beam crashed behind them, missing Luke by inches. He stumbled, and Martha caught his arm, dragging him toward the doorway. They burst outside just as the roof gave way, the barn collapsing into a storm of sparks behind them. For a few seconds, all they could do was gasp for breath. Their hands still clutched tight around each other's arms. "Are you out of your mind?" she panted. He gave a shaky laugh. "Takes one to know one." Then, amid the chaos, they heard shouting from the other side of the yard. Charles Kerrigan, standing near the corral, his face ghost-pale in the flickering light. "The Northfield's gone," he shouted. "Get the wagon, save what you can." Luke straightened, still breathing hard. He turned to Martha. "Go back, it's not safe here." "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "You need every hand you can get." He opened his mouth to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. Instead, he nodded. Together, they joined the line of men, hauling buckets and beating down the fire where it jumped the fence. Hours passed before the flames finally died. Dawn crept across the sky, pale and smoky, revealing the wreckage. Half the ranch blackened and smoldering, but the main house still standing. Luke's father approached, his fine clothes streaked with soot. He looked from Luke to Martha, then back again. For once, his voice held no arrogance, only weary gratitude. "You saved what mattered most," he said quietly. "Both of you." Martha said nothing, too exhausted to speak. But when Luke reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. In the soft morning light, surrounded by ashes and ruin, they stood together, two souls bound by the fire they'd fought and the truth it had revealed. It wasn't wealth or status that mattered. It wasn't even survival. It was the simple, unbreakable thing that had carried them both through every storm before this one. Love born from courage, and courage born from love. The fire had left a scar on Dusty Creek that would take seasons to heal. The Kerrigan Ranch's once green pastures were black and brittle, its barns reduced to ash. But in the strange, quiet dawn that followed the destruction, something else had begun to grow. A new understanding between Luke Kerrigan, his proud father, and the woman who had stood against both the storm and the fire. For the first time, Charles Kerrigan seemed smaller, not in stature, but in certainty. He had seen his son nearly die twice now, once in the wilderness, once in the flames. And in both moments, it was the same woman, a widow with nothing, who had fought to keep him alive. Martha stood beside the barn ruins, her hair tangled and face smudged with soot, watching the men begin repairs. When Charles approached, she expected the same cold formality as before. But this time his tone carried quiet respect. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, removing his hat, "you've done more for this ranch than some who've worked here their whole lives." Martha looked up, wary. "I only did what anyone would have done." He shook his head. "No, most would have turned away." "You didn't." For a moment she didn't know how to reply. This was a man who'd once tried to buy her gratitude with gold coins, and now he stood before her with something rarer: humility. Luke joined them, his arm bandaged, eyes tired but alive. "We lost a lot," he said quietly, "but not everything." Charles gave him a long look, then nodded slowly. "Maybe it's time I stop running this place like it's mine alone. Maybe you've earned the right to make it yours." Luke frowned. "That's not what this was about, Father." "I know," Charles interrupted softly. "That's why you deserve it." He turned to Martha again. "You should stay here a while," he said. "We'll need help rebuilding. You've got a good head and stronger hands than most men I've hired." Martha hesitated. The offer was practical, but beneath it, she sensed something deeper, a kind of unspoken apology. Still, her pride wouldn't let her accept out of pity. "I'll stay to help," she said finally, "but only till you've got your feet under you again. After that, I've a house to tend and fences to mend of my own." Charles nodded once, tipping his hat before walking away, leaving Luke smiling faintly at her side. When they were alone, Luke said, "You know he's not used to asking anyone for anything." "You just witnessed a miracle," Martha smiled faintly. "Then maybe the fire burned more than timber." He laughed softly, then looked out over the blackened fields. "There's a lot of rebuilding to do." "There always is after a storm," she said, her voice gentler now. He turned toward her, eyes searching hers. "Martha, when I left you, I thought I was doing the right thing. But when I saw that fire, all I could think was that I might never see you again, and that scared me more than any blaze could." Her heart beat faster. "Luke, I don't care about land or money or what my father thinks," he went on. "What matters is you. You saw me when I was just a man lost in the rain, and that's who I want to be, with you." For a moment, she couldn't speak. The memory of all she'd lost, the husband buried in the small graveyard, the hard years that followed, rose in her chest. But then she looked at Luke, soot-streaked and stubbornly sincere, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. "You're sure about this?" she asked softly. He nodded. "I've never been sure of anything," she exhaled slowly, a small, trembling smile forming. "Then I suppose we've both got something new to build." Luke reached for her hand, rough and calloused like his own. "Together?" "Together," she said. And as the morning sun broke over the horizon, turning the charred earth to gold, Martha Jenkins and Luke Kerrigan stood amid the ashes, not as a widow and a rancher's son, but as two souls who had found each other in the storm, the fire and the quiet that followed. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive dressed in finery or fortune. Sometimes it walks through the rain, stumbles through the flames, and comes out the other side stronger than ever before. The morning after Charles Kerrigan's visit, the air in Dusty Creek felt heavier than before, though the skies were clear. Martha Jenkins tried to go about her chores, but her thoughts kept circling back to the man in the fine coat and the truth he'd carried with him. Luke Kerrigan, the quiet stranger she'd nursed through a storm, wasn't a wandering cowboy after all. He was heir to the richest ranch in the county. The revelation stung like cold wind against bare skin. She remembered his gentle hands patching her fence, the way he'd smiled when she teased him about being a drifter. All the while, he'd been hiding a truth that changed everything. Still, some part of her heart refused to believe the worst. Maybe he'd had a reason. Maybe he'd wanted to be judged for the man he was, not the name he carried. Yet reason didn't quiet the ache. It had been a long time since anyone had made her feel seen, and even longer since she'd allowed herself to hope. That afternoon, as she swept the porch, she saw dust rising on the road again. For a heartbeat, she thought it was the wind. Then the figure on horseback emerged. Luke, riding hard, his hat pulled low, his face shadowed by something she couldn't yet name, her hands stilled on the broom handle. He dismounted before she could speak. "Martha," he said, his voice low and breathless. "My father was here, wasn't he?" She nodded, her chin lifting slightly. "Yesterday. Came looking for you." Luke's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry for that. I never meant for him to drag you into my family's business." "Your family's business," she repeated, the words sharp as broken glass. "Seems you left out quite a bit of that when you were sitting by my fire." He took a hesitant step closer. "I should have told you, I know. But when you found me that night, I wasn't thinking about who I was. I was just trying to survive." "You could have told me after," she said quietly. "You had days." "I was afraid," he admitted. "You treat people for who they are. My father's name changes that. Every time." Her throat tightened. "And you thought I'd start bowing and scraping soon as I knew?" "No," he said softly. "I thought you'd stop looking at me the way you did." The silence that followed was thick, humming with everything neither could say. The wind stirred between them, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet come. Finally, Martha crossed her arms. "Your father tried to pay me for saving you," she said. Luke's face hardened. "He what?" "Brought a pouch of coins. Called it compensation." He cursed under his breath, looking away. "That's just like him, thinking everything in this world can be squared off with money." Martha studied him quietly. "And what about you, Luke? What do you think everything costs?" He met her gaze, steady now. "I think some things are worth more than money'll ever buy." Her breath caught at the sincerity in his voice, but before she could answer, the rhythmic clatter of wheels drew their attention. A carriage again. His father's. Charles Kerrigan stepped out, his fine coat gleaming, his expression composed but sharp. "Luke!" he called, tone brisk. "We've been looking for you since the storm. You've caused quite a stir." His gaze shifted to Martha, and though his smile was polite, it didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Jenkins, my offer still stands. It's not charity, just fairness. Take the money," Martha's jaw set. "I don't take payment for decency, Mr. Kerrigan." Charles sighed, as though dealing with stubborn children. "You've proven your pride. Don't let it blind you." But before Martha could reply, Luke stepped forward, voice like steel. "You'll stop insulting her, Father. She saved my life. If you can't see the worth in that, maybe it's you who's blind." The older man stiffened. The air between father and son crackled like the tail end of a storm. Charles turned on his heel and climbed back into the carriage. "You'll see sense soon enough," he said coldly. "Both of you." Then he was gone, dust curling behind the wheels. Martha stood silent, her pulse thundering. Luke turned to her, eyes soft again. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "For all of it." She looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Sorry won't mend fences, Mr. Kerrigan, but maybe honesty can." And with that, she walked back toward her house, leaving the door open behind her, just wide enough for him to follow if he dared. For 3 days after Charles Kerrigan's carriage disappeared down the road, Luke stayed at Martha's farm. Not because he had to, but because leaving felt impossible. The storm had passed, the fences were fixed, and the roads were clear again. Yet every morning when the first light touched the fields, Luke found himself still there, mending tools that didn't need mending, hauling water that Martha could have fetched herself. She didn't tell him to go, but she didn't ask him to stay either. Their words came slower now, weighted with all the things neither dared to name. He'd joined her for breakfast one morning, and though they spoke only of simple things, of hens and the coming harvest, the air between them hummed like the quiet after thunder. Still, Martha's heart was wary. Every time she looked at him, she saw 2 men, the one who'd shared her table in the storm, and the one who belonged to a world that would never see her as his equal. That afternoon, as the sun burned low, Luke found her by the barn, mending a torn feed sack. "You're working yourself thin again," he said gently. She didn't look up. "Work's all I've got left that don't leave me." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "You've got more than that." Her hands stilled. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say things that'll make leaving harder than it already is." "Martha." "You'll have to go home," she said, cutting him off, her voice quiet but steady. "To your father, your ranch, your people. You belong there, Luke. I don't fit in that world, and I don't need to." He studied her face, lined by struggle but softened by strength. "You think I care about any of that?" "I think you don't understand how folks like your father think," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "He'll never see me as anything but a poor widow with empty land and dirt under her nails." Luke's jaw set. "Then he's wrong. Maybe," she said softly. "But he's powerful. Men like that don't have to be right. They just have to speak, and everyone listens." He fell silent, his fists curling at his sides. Then he said almost fiercely, "You pulled me from the mud when no one else would have risked it. You fed me when you had almost nothing. You think I could just walk away from that? From you?" Her throat tightened. "You don't owe me anything, Luke." "It's not about owing," he said, stepping closer. "It's about choosing." The words hit her like the first drop of rain before a storm. She looked away, blinking fast. "Don't talk like that. You'll go back and time will pass and you'll forget. I'm just a woman who helped you when you were lost." He reached out, his fingers brushing her wrist. "You think I'll forget the only person who ever saw me for who I was, not for my name, not for the ranch, not for what I can buy?" Her breath caught. The warmth of his touch burned through her resolve. But before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the road. 3 riders, men in Kerrigan ranch coats. One of them tipped his hat politely as he approached. "Mr. Luke, sir," the man said, "your father sent us. Says there's business waiting and the herd's short-handed. He needs you back." Luke's hand fell away. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he nodded. "Tell him I'll come," he said quietly. The men rode off, leaving only dust behind. Martha turned away, hiding the tears that stung her eyes. "There," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Looks like the world's already calling you home." He stood behind her, silent for a moment. Then softly, "Maybe, but I'll be back, Martha." "I swear it," she didn't answer. She couldn't trust her voice to hold. When he finally rode away at sunset, the light caught on the horizon like fire. Martha watched until he disappeared beyond the ridge. She told herself it was better this way, that she was only a widow, and he was only a man passing through. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't true. He hadn't just passed through her life. He'd changed its course entirely, and her heart, once cold and still, beat with something dangerous again. Hope. By the time the skies cleared completely, Dusty Creek was unrecognizable. The land glistened under a washed-out sun, littered with broken branches, uprooted fences, and mud that clung to every step. Martha Jenkins stood on her porch, surveying the ruin of her little world. The storm had ripped the shingles from her roof and flooded half her chicken coop. What few crops she dared to plant were flattened to the earth. She should have felt despair, but she didn't. Not entirely. Because somewhere inside her home, a man who wasn't supposed to be there was mending a window frame with steady hands and a quiet focus that made the place feel less empty. Luke Kerrigan had healed enough to move with strength again, though the bruise along his ribs still made him wince from time to time. He'd refused to leave right away, insisting that he owed her more than a thank you. "You dragged me out of the mud," he said. "Least I can do is help put your place back together." Martha had tried to argue, but truth be told, the company was something she'd forgotten how to refuse. For the next few days, they worked together. Luke fixed the sagging fence posts and cleared the fallen branches while Martha patched leaks, baked bread, and kept the coffee hot. Their conversation was simple at first, talk of weather, crops, and repairs. But beneath those ordinary words ran something deeper, an awareness of each other neither dared speak aloud. One afternoon, while Luke hammered a rail into place, Martha brought him a cup of water. The sun caught the sweat on his temples, and she found herself studying the way he paused before thanking her, his eyes soft but searching. "You work too hard," she said, half to distract herself. He grinned. "You sound like my mother. Haven't heard that tone since I left home." "Your mother?" she asked. "Where's home for you, Mr. Carrigan?" He hesitated, just long enough for her to notice. "North of here. Past the ridge. Big spread of land. You wouldn't know it." She tilted her head. "A ranch hand, then?" He nodded, though there was something guarded in his expression. "Something like that." Martha smiled faintly. "Then you'll know what hard work really is." He looked at her then, really looked, and said quietly, "So do you." The words landed heavier than they should have, and Martha turned away before he could see the heat rising in her cheeks. That evening, as the sun slipped low over the fields, they sat outside with coffee in tin mugs. The air was sweet after the storm, filled with the sound of crickets and the soft rush of the creek. Luke told her stories, short, half-finished tales about ranch work, horses, and far-off towns. She listened with the kind of attention she hadn't given anyone in years. Yet there was always something missing from his stories. He never spoke of family, or where he'd been headed that night, or why a man with fine boots and calloused hands was out alone in a storm. Once, she nearly asked. The question burned on her tongue, but she swallowed it. Everyone had ghosts. She knew what it meant to keep them buried. The next morning, he saddled a borrowed horse he'd found wandering near the creek. A strong bay mare that must have belonged to him before the storm. He looked uneasy, as though the road ahead weighed heavier than it should. "I owe you more than I can say," he told her. "When I left, I was lost in more ways than one. You gave me a place to stand again." Martha folded her arms, fighting the ache in her chest. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Carrigan. I did what anyone would have done." He gave her a small, crooked smile. "You and I both know that's not true." And then he rode off, the morning light catching on the wet grass as his figure disappeared down the ridge road. Martha stood there long after he was gone, the echo of hoofbeats fading into the wind. She told herself he was just another traveler passing through. But her heart knew better. Something had shifted inside her. A door she thought long closed had quietly opened again. It had been nearly a week since Luke Carrigan rode away. But for Martha Jenkins, his absence lingered like the echo of a song unfinished. The days stretched long and quiet again, filled with the familiar rhythm of chores, the scrape of the broom, the creak of the well handle, the whisper of wind against the window. Yet nothing sounded quite the same. She caught herself setting an extra cup on the table more than once. When she kneaded dough, she remembered his voice teasing her about her iron hands. When she stepped onto the porch at sunset, she half expected to see his figure riding back over the hill. But he didn't, and she told herself it was better that way. Life went on. Then one afternoon, as she hung laundry to dry on the line, she heard the distant rumble of wheels, a sound rare this far from town. A moment later, the shape of a fine black carriage appeared on the ridge, drawn by two matching horses, polished to a gleam. Her heart skipped. Luke? But as it neared, she realized it was not him who drove the team. The carriage rolled to a stop before her gate. Out stepped a man in a long, dark coat, silver hair slicked neatly beneath a hat. His boots shone. His gaze swept across her humble yard like a surveyor assessing property. Everything about him spoke of wealth, control, and impatience. "Mrs. Jenkins?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Yes," she said slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Can I help you, sir?" He glanced around before replying. "I'm looking for my son, Luke Carrigan. He hasn't returned home, and word in town says a man matching his description was seen riding this way before the storm." Martha's breath caught. So Carrigan. The name wasn't just a name. She nodded, careful. "He was here, yes. He was hurt when I found him. The storm near killed him. But he left some days ago, fit enough to ride." The man's shoulders eased a fraction, though his eyes still held a sharp edge. "You have my thanks for your kindness, madam." She noticed the gold watch chain across his vest, the fine gloves, the carriage wheels that gleamed as if they'd never known mud. "You're his father," she said, realizing it aloud. "Charles Carrigan," he replied, with a tone that suggested the name should mean something. And it did. She remembered hearing it whispered in town years ago. The owner of Carrigan Ranch, said to stretch for miles across the valley. "Richest man in the county." A man whose cattle grazed more land than Dusty Creek had people. Charles looked at her modest home with polite discomfort. Luke can be impulsive. I imagine he didn't trouble you much. No, she said, straightening. He was no trouble at all. Good, Charles replied shortly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, offering it toward her. For your trouble, I insist, Martha froze. Inside the pouch, she saw the glint of coins, more money than she'd seen in years. It felt like a slap. I don't want your money, Mr. Carrigan, she said, her voice cool and steady. The older man blinked, surprised. You must have spent time and supplies nursing him. Consider it fair compensation. I said no. Her hands stayed at her sides. Your son's life wasn't bought, sir. It was saved. There's a difference. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and uneasy. Then Charles Carrigan's expression softened, if only a little. You're a proud woman, Mrs. Jenkins. She met his gaze. Only as proud as hunger lets me be. He gave a curt nod, tipped his hat, and turned back to the carriage. If my son returns this way, send word to the Carrigan Ranch. I will, she said, though she wasn't sure she meant it. As the carriage rolled away, Martha stood watching until the dust settled. Her heart beat unevenly. Luke had hidden who he was, not a simple ranch hand, but heir to the largest estate in the county. A man of means, pretending to be a drifter. For the first time, she felt foolish, and worse, betrayed. That night, as she sat by the dying fire, she whispered to herself, Rich men don't come knocking on widow doors unless they've lost their way. But even as she said it, her thoughts betrayed her again, wondering if Luke would still come back. Not as a rich man's son, but as the man who'd once shared her fire and mended her fence. When dawn finally crept across the sky, it came pale and trembling, as if afraid to disturb the wreck the night had left behind. The storm had passed, leaving behind silence so deep that even the trees seemed stunned. Martha Jenkins stepped out of her doorway into a world reborn in ruin. Her fields were flooded, the fences broken clean through, and the road to town had turned into a brown river. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked toward the barn. A thin trail of smoke rose from her chimney, the only sign of life for miles. Inside, a man lay sleeping on her straw bed, his breathing shallow but steady. Martha had checked on him through the night, changing the cloth on his head when fever began to creep in. She'd sat beside him with her Bible open, whispering words she wasn't sure she believed anymore. He was a stranger and ye took him in, the verse had said. So she had. Now, in the thin gray light, she could see him better. His hair was dark, his jaw strong, and there was a scar near his ear, a pale reminder of some old fight. His hands, though bruised, told their own story. Rough palms, strong fingers, nails worn and nicked from years of work. Not the hands of a man soft with money. She poured a little water into a tin cup, then knelt beside him. Sir, she said softly, you're safe here. Do you remember your name? He stirred, eyes flickering open. They were gray, sharp even through the fog of exhaustion. For a moment he looked confused, then wary. Where am I? His voice was hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. My farm, Martha said. You were thrown from your horse last night in the storm. You're lucky to be alive. He tried to sit up, but winced, clutching his side. The horse, did you see him? No, she replied. Only you. The wind took everything else. He sighed, falling back against the straw. Name's Luke, he said after a pause. Luke Carrigan. The name stirred no recognition in Martha. You're welcome to rest here till you're fit to ride again, Mr. Carrigan. The storm tore up most of the road anyway. Won't be safe to travel for a spell. He gave her a faint, crooked smile. You're mighty kind, Mrs. Jenkins, she said, adjusting the blanket over him. Martha Jenkins. And I'm not kind. Just stubborn enough not to let a man die in my barn. He gave a weak chuckle, though it turned quickly into a cough. Well, stubborn women tend to save more lives than the kind ones. That earned the smallest smile from her, one that surprised even herself. She hadn't smiled in months. As the day wore on, she brought him broth, tended the fire, and tried not to ask too many questions. Still, curiosity burned at the edges of her thoughts. His clothes were well made but travel-worn. His boots were stamped with the kind of craftsmanship no drifter could afford. Yet he didn't carry himself like a man born to wealth. There was humility in the way he thanked her, in how he looked at the floor instead of her eyes. Later, while he slept again, she stepped outside to gather kindling. The world smelled of wet earth and ash. A few broken boards from her fence lay scattered in the field. She sighed, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. Through the barn's open crack, she saw him again, the stranger who'd fallen from the sky, it seemed, and something unspoken twisted in her chest. Maybe it was worry. Maybe it was something softer, something she didn't want to name. She shook her head and whispered to the wind. "He'll be gone soon enough," but deep down, a voice she hadn't heard in years whispered back, "And what if he isn't?" For the next 2 days, the storm kept the world sealed in gray. The rain slowed to a whisper, but the wind still prowled the edges of the fields, moaning through the broken fence posts like a restless spirit. The roads were flooded, the creek was swollen, and there was no chance of getting to town. So the stranger, Luke Kerrigan, stayed. Martha told herself she didn't mind. A man half-conscious with fever wasn't much company. Still, every time she brought him food or fresh water, she caught herself studying him too closely, the shape of his shoulders, the steadiness in his eyes when the fever broke. He wasn't a boastful man, nor one to fill the silence with unnecessary words. But when he did speak, there was a weight in his voice, like he carried stories he wasn't ready to tell. On the morning of the 3rd day, she found him sitting up, his coat draped over his shoulders. He'd managed to stand, though it looked like every breath cost him effort. "You've no business being on your feet," she scolded. "You'll tear your wound open again," he smiled faintly. "I've laid about long enough. Don't feel right, being waited on by a woman who looks like she's worked twice as hard as I ever have." That earned him a sharp look, but not an unkind one. "You're in no shape to work, Mr. Kerrigan. Besides, there's not much to fix that the Lord himself hasn't already broken." He tilted his head toward the window. "Storm hit you hard." She followed his gaze. The fence was down, one corner of the roof sagging where the wind had caught it. "Hard enough," she said quietly. "But I've seen worse." Luke studied her for a long moment. "You live here alone?" The question seemed innocent enough, but it made her chest tighten. "Since my husband passed," she answered simply, turning away. "Been just me and the hens ever since." He didn't press further, though the silence that followed said he understood more than she wished he did. Later, when the sky began to clear, Luke insisted on helping her repair the damage. He found an old hammer in her shed and started mending the fence despite his injuries. Martha tried to stop him, but he only smiled that stubborn, boyish smile and said, "Can't sit idle when there's work begging to be done." They worked side by side through the afternoon, the rhythm of labor slowly easing the distance between them. She handed him nails, he steadied the boards, and between the thud of the hammer and the soft sigh of the wind, a strange peace settled. Martha found herself laughing once, truly laughing, when a nail slipped and Luke cursed under his breath, his ears flushing red. It felt like sunlight after a long winter. As evening fell, she brewed coffee and they sat by the fire, the scent of smoke and damp earth filling the small room. Luke spoke little, but his eyes roamed the place, the patched curtains, the tidy shelves, the row of dried herbs above the window. Finally, he said quietly, "You've done well, keeping this place going on your own." Martha's fingers tightened around her cup. "I get by," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Sometimes that's all there is," he nodded, thoughtful. "You've got grit, Mrs. Jenkins, more than most men I've met." That made her smile, small but real. "Grit don't keep the rain out," she murmured. "No," he said, looking into the fire, "but it keeps you standing when the rain comes." For a while, neither spoke. The storm had passed, but something else hung in the air, an understanding, fragile and wordless. When Martha finally rose to bank the fire, she saw him watching her, not with pity, not with gratitude, but with something deeper, something she didn't yet have the courage to name. The morning sun broke pale and uncertain over Dusty Creek, a thin wash of light that seemed to hesitate before touching the Jenkins farm. The old fence leaned tiredly against the wind, and the roof of the barn rattled with every sigh of the prairie breeze. Inside a drafty kitchen, Martha Jenkins stirred a pot of thin cornmeal porridge over a low fire. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Martha had been a widow for 2 years. Her husband, Eli Jenkins, had been a good man, steady and kind, but death had taken him quick with fever and cough in the heart of a cruel winter. Since then, Martha's life had been measured in small acts of endurance, hauling water from the well, mending clothes until the fabric gave up, baking loaves of bread to sell in town for a few coins. The debts Eli left behind hung over her like a shadow that never moved. Neighbors in Dusty Creek pitied her, though few ever came around. "Poor Martha," they'd whisper at the general store. "Still hanging on somehow." Some offered scraps of work or leftover feed, but pride kept her from taking much. She'd rather go hungry than feel beholden to anyone. Pride and memory were all she had left of Eli, and she guarded them fiercely. Her small farm lay at the edge of the county, where the land rolled into wild prairie and no one passed unless they were lost. The soil had grown mean, the hens laid few eggs, and the rains, when they came, washed more hope away than they gave. Yet Martha stayed. She had nowhere else to go, and something deep in her bones told her this place, rough and lonely as it was, still belonged to her. That morning, clouds gathered early, thick, gray, and low. The wind had a strange bite to it, whistling through the cracks of the house. Martha watched the sky from the porch, her arms folded tight against the chill. Storm weather, she thought. Maybe the worst kind. She went about her chores quicker than usual, bringing in the hens, covering the wood pile, checking the windows for leaks. By late afternoon, the world turned the color of pewter. The first drops came like needles, stinging against her cheeks. She hurried inside, bolting the door just as thunder rolled across the fields like cannon fire. Lightning lit the distant hills, and the storm broke loose, fierce, unrelenting, alive. The wind howled through the eaves, shaking the shutters. Martha wrapped herself in a shawl by the hearth, praying the roof would hold. Every gust made the walls groan, and the lantern light flickered wildly. She tried to read her worn Bible, but the words blurred, her thoughts drifting back to Eli. He'd always known how to tie down the roof, how to calm her fears when the storms came. Without him, every sound felt louder, every shadow deeper. Hours passed. The storm didn't ease, it grew worse. The rain became a steady roar, and the creek behind the house swelled into a violent rush. Then, amid the thunder, she heard it, a dull, heavy crash from somewhere outside. Not the wind, not a branch. Something, or someone, had fallen near the barn. Martha froze. Her first instinct was fear, but then something stronger rose in her, a stubborn, quiet courage she didn't know she still had. Grabbing her lantern and pulling her shawl tighter, she opened the door. Rain lashed her face. The yard was a blur of water and mud. Still, she stepped into the storm, boots sinking deep, the lantern trembling in her hand. She could barely see through the downpour, but there, by the fence, lay a dark shape, unmoving. A man, maybe? A fallen rider? Her heart thudded hard. Against every sensible thought, Martha started toward him. The storm screaming all around. She didn't know it yet. But that single act, walking out into the storm to help a stranger, was the moment her lonely, faded world began to change. The storm had become a living thing, howling, breathing, clawing at the earth with hands of wind and rain. The air was so thick with water that Martha could barely draw breath as she stumbled toward the fallen shape by the fence. Her lantern light quivered wildly, casting broken flashes of gold across the mud. Thunder cracked overhead, rolling like an angry beast across the dark prairie. She reached him at last, a man sprawled face down in the dirt, his coat soaked through, his hat lost to the wind. A horse's tracks led to the fence, then vanished into the storm. Whoever he was, he'd been thrown hard. Martha crouched beside him, her skirts plastered to her legs, and shouted over the roar of rain, "Sir, can you hear me?" No answer. She touched his shoulder. His body was cold but not stiff. With trembling fingers, she turned him onto his back. The lantern's weak glow revealed a face streaked with mud and rain, cut across the forehead, his jaw shadowed with stubble. He looked to be in his 30s, young enough to have strength, old enough to have seen trouble. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "You'll die out here," he groaned faintly, eyes fluttering open for just a moment. "My horse," he muttered. The rest was lost to the storm. Martha's heart pounded. She was small, but years of hard work had made her stronger than she looked. She hooked her hands beneath his arms and dragged him through the mud, inch by inch, toward the barn. The wind fought her every step. Lightning flashed so close that she felt the heat of it. Her breath came in gasps, but she didn't stop. Not until she reached the heavy barn door and hauled it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and damp wood. She pulled the man to a pile of straw near the wall, rolled him onto his side, and dropped beside him, her chest burning. For a moment she could do nothing but listen to the storm pounding against the roof. When her strength returned, she brought the lantern close. Blood trickled from a gash above his temple. His clothes, fine leather gloves, a wool coat, boots with silver buckles, told her he wasn't some drifting drifter. But his hands were calloused, his skin bronzed by sun and wind. A man who worked for his living, not one who only watched others do it. She fetched a bucket of water and a strip of clean cloth from her basket of rags. As she cleaned his wound, she spoke softly, half to him, half to herself. "You must have lost your way in the storm. Should have known better than to ride the ridge this time of year. Still, I suppose I can't fault you. The Lord leads folks to strange doors sometimes." The man stirred again, his hand twitching as if reaching for something unseen. "Don't move," Martha warned gently. "You're safe for now." After she'd done what she could, she covered him with an old blanket and went to check the house. The storm hadn't eased. It screamed through the night like a living curse. Water crept under the door, the roof groaned, and the lanterns flickered low. She thought of the stranger lying in her barn and wondered what kind of man he was. Cowhand, outlaw, or something in between. As midnight passed, she lay awake, listening to the thunder and to the faint sound of his breathing through the wall. It was strange having another soul so close again. She'd grown used to silence since Eli died, used to hearing only her own thoughts. Now there was life stirring nearby, fragile, uncertain, but real. And as lightning split the sky one last time, Martha felt a stirring deep in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fear. It was the beginning of change, sweeping in with the storm,